Steven Pinker is an experimental cognitive scientist, one of the world's foremost writers on language, mind, human nature. He's the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, and his earlier books include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Sense of Style. This is one thing I didn't know. He is chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. So in his off time, you know. And he's been named by Time magazine one of the 100 most influential people in the world today. His 10th book is this one, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And Bill Gates recently called it his new favorite book of all time. So if you're worried or convinced that the world is falling apart, Steven urges you to follow the data. In the book 70+ graphs, he shows that I'm sure he'll say it as well, but just all sorts of things are better than they've ever been, not just in the West, but worldwide, and the trends are moving in that direction. He contends this progress is not accident, it's not cosmic, contention. It's the gift of the Enlightenment, the conviction that reason and science can enhance human flourishing. Steven, I like folks to get a feel for the people behind the words and the idea and the work that we're going to talk about. So I laid out some highlights, but in your own words, briefly, how do you describe your path to the work you're doing these days? And I'm looking for mentors, turning points, moments of decision.
Yeah, it's not obvious why a guy who studied irregular verbs would be writing a book on the history of genocide and torture and slavery, followed by a book on the history of famine and poverty and oppression and early death. So it was a circuitous path that led me there. I am a cognitive psychologist, so as an undergraduate I became interested in what was then a new field. How does the mind work? A field that was centered in experimental psychology, that was what my field was, but also brought in ideas from artificial intelligence, from linguistics, from neuroscience, from philosophy of mind. And I did work on visual imagery, how you can close your eyes and visualize a scene, visualize what it looks like from different vantage points, move your spotlight of attention across the visual field, recognize shapes and faces. I also was interested in language, in particular how children acquire their mother tongue, and what are the different components of language? Why is it such a combination of beautiful, elegant, almost mathematical rules, but with so many quirks and exceptions and oddities? And that's what led to the irregular verbs. You know, we have this was an obsession of mine for a good 10 years. Not so much because I was a language lover for the sake of language, but for what it revealed about the human mind. Namely that we have these mental algorithms that we use in understanding and producing sentences. We don't just retrieve sentences from a memorized list like a wind-up doll, but we've got algorithms for understanding and producing words. You see it even in young kids when they make errors like I sticked it to the wall and then it teared and then it braked. They are applying the mental equivalent of a rule of grammar, add ed to form the past tense. Of course, not consciously, but that's just the way the human mind processes language. We effortlessly combine things. But then because of quirks in the history of the English language, we also ended up with break broke and tear tore and go went and 150 or so exceptions. And of course, when you learn a foreign language, that's what makes it such torture.
That's right, you're describing a child. I'm thinking of myself when I visit Mexico.
Precisely, yes. Anyway, that was, for me, irregular verbs were a way of getting into what's sometimes called cognitive architecture. Namely, what kind of computational steps does the brain go through in language? But if it's doing it for language, it must be doing it for thought, because the only reason we have language is to share thoughts. And so the assembly of complex phrases and sentences out of words and bits of words parallels the combination of simple ideas into more complex ideas. Anyway, that's the work I did in cognitive science.
And there were some who would have stayed in that for the rest of their career.
I'm often stunned when I sometimes go back to conferences and I meet the people that I knew 30 years ago doing the same thing they did 30 years ago. I mean, bless their hearts, that's what scholarship often consists of. But I get bored. So my trajectory, which is a little odd, I was partly influenced being a psycholinguist by the ideas of Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist who was my colleague at MIT for a number of years, who proposed that language was an innate component of the mind. It was quite a radical suggestion when he proposed it. It led to the question, what are the other innate components of the mind? And that drew me into evolutionary psychology and into an interest in other mental components, faculties, systems, modules, organs, whatever you want to call them, such as fear and love of family and moral emotions like sympathy, trust, and gratitude. So I kind of did an inventory of the major parts of the mind in a book called How the Mind Works, language just being one of them. And it led to the bigger questions about human nature, because I noticed that the very idea that the mind was shaped by evolution so as to have a lot of built-in structure. That is, the mind is not a tabula rasa, a blank slate, at least so I argued. But I bumped up into opposition that was not just scientific, but also emotional and moral and political. There was something politically incorrect about saying that the mind was packed with innate structure. Now, Chomsky got away with it because he's also a pretty hard leftist, so no one could accuse him of having any right-wing politics. But in general, in many people's minds, there was a kind of association between innatism and right-wing politics, because for a number of reasons. One of them is if we are blank slates, if we're born with nothing and everything comes from socialization and parenting and messages from the culture, well, that means that everyone is equal. That is, it seems like a shortcut to egalitarianism. Yeah. No one's smarter than anyone else. No one's more ambitious than anyone else. Men and women have to be identical, because if you're a blank slate, blank equals blank, 0 equals 0. And so that made the blank slate politically more palatable to a lot of people. Also, if you believe in a kind of perfectibility of mankind, as the old phrase has it, then which is much easier if we are blank slates, and you just program education and the media to bring up nice cooperative people, and you could have a utopia. And so, on the other hand, if we are saddled with innate traits like sexual jealousy or aggression and dominance, maybe sex differences, then it's much harder to bring about what some people would think of as an ideal society of perfect equality and cooperation. So that's another reason why the idea that we're fitted with anything doesn't sit well for political reasons. So that led me to a book called The Blank Slate, arguing against the blank slate, but really trying to deconstruct the political controversies. Why should this be so emotionally fraught? And what I argued was that these political controversies came from a kind of lazy thinking, that shortcuts to ideals like equality, which should not depend, political equality should not depend on the idea that we're clones or blank slates. It's not a literal statement that everyone is indistinguishable from everyone else. It's a statement that we treat people as individuals, and we don't prejudge them based on properties of their group.
You're saying that when it comes to a society, it comes down to not what we were born, not how we were born, but how we treat each other.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
once we're in a social situation, that's what will matter.
And when we make policy decisions like political rights and entry to school, of course you don't look at someone's sex or race or ethnicity. You judge them as an individual. And as long as you have that policy, then you shouldn't be terrified at the possibility that some people may have been born with a better genetic hand than others. You treat people according to their rights, their deserts, their talents, and so on. Likewise, the idea that we may be born with some nasty and ugly traits like rage, like self-centeredness, like jealousy, like lust, doesn't mean that we're doomed to fight and squabble for all eternity, because that's not all we have, especially if you believe, as I do, that there are a number of mental systems. Then countering the rather darker parts of our nature, we also have self-control, we have empathy, we have cognitive processes that come up with norms and rules and institutions. We have language that allows us to share them. There's a constant battle inside the skull between the different parts of human nature. And I noted, just in passing, that as an example, there can't really be a fear that if humans had aggressive impulses, we'd be doomed to eternal warfare, because you just look at history. A lot of violent practices were abolished, like slavery, like the Soviet Empire collapsed with almost no violence. And I stumbled across this graph that I just mentioned that, to my surprise, if you look at homicide statistics, which go back in parts of Europe hundreds of years, because the kings used to keep records of who killed whom because they could confiscate the assets of the family of the killer.
That's right. And Shakespeare needed them for his plots.
Shakespeare, right. Anyway, I was stunned to find that the rate of homicide plummeted over several hundred years. So you were 35 times more likely to be murdered in the 14th century in England than in the 20th century. Anyway, I threw that in, and I repeated as just to reiterate the point that it's silly to worry that if there's such a thing as human nature, then you can't change society, because you don't even have to look at human nature. Look at history. Societies change. Obviously, they change. Anyway, when I repeated this in a blog post, answering a question that my literary agent posed to all of his stable of writers, he said, this year, what are you optimistic about? And so I kind of dug out the parts of that book that were on changes in violence, and I said, well, by a lot of measures, violence seems to have decreased. And I got, when that was posted, I got correspondence from historians and political scientists and sociologists who said, you know, you could have mentioned even more examples of how violence had declined. So one team that tallies every year the number of people killed in wars said, well, we've been plotting them on a graph, and the graph goes like that. Every year, fewer people are killed in war. I didn't know that. Someone else said, did you know that rates of child abuse have gone down, physical abuse and sexual abuse, since they've been measured? Someone else said, did you know that it's not just England where the homicide rates plummeted, but it's Italy and Scandinavia and Netherlands and Germany. Basically, wherever there's data, you find the same historical change. And then someone else said, you know that rates of domestic violence, beating of wives and girlfriends, gone down. I thought, my goodness, number one, no, I didn't know any of these things. No one does, because the view of the world that you get from the papers is about whatever violence continues to exist.
Are there still papers?
Well, yes, that's speaking figuratively.
Yes,
yes, that's right. Yes,
from the media.
Yeah, you know, there's a service where they every day they download the news, they print it out in a hard copy, they deliver it to your doorstep. Isn't that amazing?
Well, you knew they'd come up with that eventually.
Yeah, you're right. So, for one, I was just astonished at how many different declines, historical declines of violence there were. Just like most people, getting my view of the world from the news, which reports whatever violence there is, and whether it's 35 murders per 100,000 per year or 10 murders per 100,000 per year, both of them are enough to fill the papers with.
That's right. With one a day, for sure.
With one a day, and so you can't tell.
Yeah.
So part of it is I realized this is a story that has to get out there, but then also as a psychologist, I thought, how can it be that the same species that used to keep slaves and disembowel people and burn heretics and murder each other over insults at the dinner table in the Middle Ages, how can that same species manage to reduce all those forms of violence? So both, where do our violent impulses come from, and what allows us to tamp them down? And I had the perfect title from Abraham Lincoln, The Better Angels of Our Nature, because it beautifully captures the idea that There's more than one angel in our nature. There are some good ones, there are some not so good ones. And this book was about the better angels. That is, what in human nature allows us to inhibit our inner demons.
And that one, just for the audience, that one really focused on violence,
Yeah.
Principally, as the symptom, let's say, that you were checking.
Exactly.
And then,
So that was about genocide and World War and torture and slavery and rape and
Abuse.
beating children and cruelty to animals. And so I wrote that book, and then I started to discover that it isn't just violence where the world has made progress. Another thing that I didn't realize, that virtually no one realizes, is that extreme poverty is plummeting. In the last 30 years, the rate of extreme poverty has fallen by 75%. That literacy is soaring, that 90% of people under the age of 25 can read and write, that diseases are being decimated. 80% of the world's population is being vaccinated. In all of these other measures of well-being, in addition to violence, there is progress. And it's not, to appreciate the progress, you don't have to just have a sunny disposition or see the glass as half full. These are big facts that no one knows. And the reason I can say that no one knows is that people have done surveys, most famously the late Swedish Dr. Hans Rosling, a TED Talk star and an author and a humanitarian. But he gave questionnaires to people in what he called the Ignorance Project, whose logo is a chimpanzee, coming from the fact that in these multiple choice questions, in his words, if he had printed the answers on bananas and had chimpanzees pick them in the zoo, they would have done better than the majority of people, including experts in public health. The reason is that people are way too pessimistic, whereas chimpanzees guess at chance. And so if you ask people, has extreme poverty increased, decreased, or say the same, everyone says it's increased. The answer is it's decreased. Chimps at least would say
50-50.
Banana's a banana, yeah. Anyway, so I thought this too seemed to be an important story. And as with the better angels of our nature, I didn't want to just say, things are getting better, there's chin up, look at the bright side, but rather, how did this happen? The universe does not have a force that makes things better. Quite the contrary. The universe, left to its own devices, grinds us down. I mean, things fall apart. There are many more
Entropy.
ways. Entropy.
In all its various forms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. If things went right, something very special happened. It's not that God smiled at us, but that people set the goal of making other people better off, and they used ingenuity, knowledge, science, policy to bring that about. And this mindset was consolidated around the 18th century during the Enlightenment, after the scientific revolution. And that seemed like a convenient kind of a rubric for this cluster of ideas that has led to the progress that we have enjoyed. Anyway,
Quick question. No, thank you, because when I pick up a book or meet an author, I'm curious what happened before page one, you know? But in terms of what you just said, you chose the Enlightenment as sort of the pivot point. Were those trends not going down prior to the Enlightenment?
It depends. Most of them were not getting better. Homicide, interestingly, was. That was a phenomenon that began in the 14th century, that declining curve. But others like, well, just the concept of democracy. I mean, it's like the ancient Greeks had their own version, their agora, but what we now think of as representative democracy was a product of that era. The idea of trade and markets as opposed to royal charters and monopolies, that anyone could sell anything to anyone. Advances in growing food, the agricultural revolution in Britain in the 18th century, crop rotation, better plows and seeds and drills, the idea that you could actually make more food grow out of the same plot of land.
But those, Stephen, would be explanations. But what you're saying is that when you look at those trends, those trends
So a lot
were more this, more flat, and then began to go up or down, whichever the good direction is for what we're talking about.
Right. The Industrial Revolution, that was when there was the first time the world saw sustained economic growth. That was more 19th century, but depended on the ideas from the 18th century. Now, not all. So some of them, I would not say that the decline in war deaths, for example, since we did have some big, fat orgies of violence in the 20th century, the decline, even though some of the ideas that eventually led to peace were voiced during the Enlightenment, but it really was only implemented after 1945.
Okay, now I'm not going to counter that by myself, but I was looking at a book review in The Guardian of the UK. So I looked at the comments. So I'm just going to quote a few lines from a comment, and then you respond. He just starts out this way. Suicide rates going through the roof, mental illness reaching epidemic proportions, a sense of meaningless futility rising, the Anthropocene extinction event in full swing, insect and bird populations crashing, tree loss out of control, the seas about to collapse as a source of food, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, suicide rates are falling, not soaring. So that's exactly backwards.
Okay.
Suicide rates have gone down over the last 30 years by 40%. Not in the United States. The United States, in some ways, is kind of a backward country. We're really not at the cutting edge of progress these days. But worldwide, there's a massive fall in suicide rates. Mental health, as best we can tell, if you apply a constant yardstick, is pretty flat over the last 30 years. There are absolutely challenges to the environment. And it's critical to realize that progress doesn't mean that everything gets better. I mean, that can't happen. That would be a miracle.
That's not progress, that's a miracle.
That's a miracle, yeah. I mean, so yeah, there are things to worry about. There are species extinctions. I mean, a collapse of the food supply is not, has been predicted many times and has not happened, and there are, so I don't think...
But I think the sea particularly, there are portions of the sea that used to feed millions that don't anymore. I mean,
although...
And the plastic and so on.
Yeah, there's no end of problems, and so it is not a refutation of the idea of progress that you can list remaining problems, because again, it's not a miracle. Of course there are problems. But on the whole, if you, as Barack Obama put it, if you had to choose a time to be alive, and you didn't know whether you'd be a man or a woman, black or white, where you'd live, you'd choose now, and that is absolutely true. I'd rather live now, even with plastics in the ocean, than to live in an era where 1/3 of my children would die. I would probably die by my 40s. I could be drafted into an army that, if I was in Tsarist Russia, I would be in the army for 25 years. Lots of reasons that it's better to be around now, even with plastics in the ocean.
I was going to save this question for towards the end, but I'm going to jump to it because we're sort of right into the meat of the contention here. In this auditorium, I interviewed Yuval Noah Harari recently. He points out that he thinks we have three big challenges: climate change, nuclear war, and technological disruption, which can take many forms, right? All sorts of things. It seems to me that the size, the enormity of a failure in any one of those could change the way we keep score, as to saying, are we better off now than other times? In other words, incrementally on all these dimensions, yes, but if we go wrong on one of those, so I was thinking, I wouldn't give us an A or a B, I'd give us an incomplete pending those three tests.
Yeah, well, it'll always be an incomplete because progress is not a force that once it is set in motion, it guarantees that problems will be solved. there is no guarantee. I would certainly agree that climate change is the biggest challenge that we face. And I think we ought to get more serious about it. And by that I mean do the math and figure out what is going to stave off the risk of a catastrophic outcome. That is to decarbonize the economy as rapidly as possible. I think we have to take seriously the threat of nuclear war, particularly a nuclear exchange, say between India and Pakistan, if they were to unleash their entire arsenals. That could lead to a nuclear
winter,
or at least a nuclear autumn, which would be bad enough. Technological change, it depends what you mean. I mean, technological change is always a challenge, and it always has been a challenge. I don't think that we are facing a potential artificial intelligence apocalypse. I do just discuss that in Enlightenment now. I think that's totally overblown, based on a misunderstanding of what artificial intelligence is. But obviously, if there are self-driving trucks, we've got to figure out how to provide
Or I always go
truck
back
drivers.
to Bill Joy's Wired cover story from, what was it, 10 years
the
ago?
Grey Goo? That was 20 years ago, yeah.
Does the future may not need us, which was about something gets replicated and out of control and so on.
Well, then the fear of the day was nanotechnology, and that was the Bill Joy cover story, was how little nanobots would replicate out of control and engulf us in gray goo.
Grey goo, exactly.
Yeah, so gray goo was the panic of the about 15, 20 years ago. Before that, I don't know if you remember the Y2K bug panic, when the year 2000 rolled around and all the world's computers would stop and nuclear missiles would be launched from their silos and planes would fall out of the sky. There are in every generation some techno-panics that in retrospect were based on a dread of occult forces which tend to be merged with the latest technology. And I tend to think that artificial intelligence is in that category.
Yeah.
So I think climate change is a very different problem. Climate change, is happening. It is going to get worse. The question is how much worse.
Right.
Nuclear weapons probably won't get used, but if they are, it would be so horrible that we should definitely worry about them. And they're designed to do damage, unlike artificial intelligence. So I would say two out of those three are worth worrying about.
So you to the question of why you and most of us don't realize the good, you said the media. Is there more at it when you began to look into the way the mind works, the way human nature works?
Yes, so there is a kind of codependency between some cognitive biases and the very nature of journalism. Namely that we tend to judge risk and probability and danger by examples, by narratives, by images, by anecdotes. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called it the availability bias. That is, availability from memory is what drives our perception of risk. If we can imagine something happening, if there was a recent example, if there was a shark attack, then we don't go into the water. If there's a plane crash, we drive. We aren't sensitive to best estimates of risk from percentages. Now, if you combine that with what journalism consists of, it kind of is anecdotes and images and narratives.
Well, but I was saying beyond journalism,
Yes, and a lot of history as well. You don't have, you have history, someone could write a history of World War II, and there'd be a lot to write about, but you wouldn't have a history of, 1909 to 1915, or 1879 to 1885. So the continuous stream of human history, with its ups and downs, is just not the way that we tend to consume history. We're interested in the tyrants, the disasters, the wars, and it can give you, even though of course they change the course of history very quickly, but then there are also things that change the course of history very gradually, and they tend to fall through the cracks if they're buried in data.
And very much this book takes a long-term view. That is to say, not necessarily, it's not so much long-term into the future, but you're looking at trends over time. And as you point out, the media looks at events.
Yeah.
And there's a very big difference.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just that I'm saying, let's go back 250 years, although we should. But the larger point is that if you look at data instead of anecdotes, you are also counting all of the countries that are not at war, all the people who don't kill each other, all the schools that don't get shot up. That changes over time, what the odds are. And that's something that you don't get just by concentrating on the remaining disasters, which, as long as they don't go to zero, there'll always be plenty to report, and your impression, thanks to the availability heuristic, can be completely disconnected from reality. And moreover, it kind of opens an opportunity for malevolent actors to game the system, to inflate our sense of danger by capitalizing on the nature of news. And the examples are rampage shooters. Why would someone kill a bunch of innocent people at a hotel or a high school? There's only one conceivable motive, and that's to get in the news, even if it's kind of enjoyed in the anticipation, and it's a posthumous fame. For some sick nobody whose dream is to be a somebody, that's a guaranteed way to become a somebody. It's the only guaranteed way to become famous. Kill a bunch of innocent people. And then you get saturation coverage. There are, I think, irresponsible practices like publishing the guy's journal and his manifestos and his selfies in commando gear, reporting things like, oh, he broke a record for the most innocent people shot in one day. Meanwhile, there's some sicko somewhere thinking,
I can beat that.
I could beat,
yeah.
Yeah. So the chance of getting killed by a rampage shooter are far smaller than the chance of being killed in a day-to-day homicide. I mean, there's a Sandy Hook massacre every day in terms of the homicide statistics. And there are other things like the opioid epidemic, which racks up serious numbers. But the fact that journalism is so event-driven means that it creates an opening for rampages, for terrorists, for kind of impresarios of outrage. So I've argued for a kind of coverage. Obviously, you can't ignore the fiascos and disasters and extravaganzas, but that it should be balanced with put in the context of the trends. So the newspapers, for some kinds of information, you do get daily reports, whichever way they go, like sports.
And stocks.
Stocks, exactly. Weather, even the horoscope you get every single day. Whereas for something like CO2 emissions or the homicide rate or the rate of war deaths, even deaths in auto accidents, the only time the paper's reported is when there's a tick in the other direction, because that's news. And so if you have something like deaths in car accidents, which have gone down, by the way, by 99% over the last 100. Yes. 99%. Now, you don't know that. Why? Well, the curve kind of looks like that. And it's, whenever there's an uptick, then it gets reported, because that's news. All the years in which it goes down, 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 that's not news. And so the only time you read about it is when it goes up. So that's misinforming readers. And there just has to be more of a statistical awareness in the practice of journalism, I argue.
One thing I think you can answer briefly, but it's that there's been a lot of talk and work over the last few years about the blind spots in the human thinking, human analysis, our irrational biases, the negativity bias, the availability bias, and so on. You're saying that it's rationality that has made all this progress, and yet we're finding that we're less rational than we thought.
Yes.
How do those two things fit?
Yes, so it's the resolution is that left to our own devices, we're not terribly rational. We have the ability to think rationally, but we don't exercise it in isolation. What we need is the right social rules that marginalize our irrationalities and bring out the rational side. And what do I mean by rules? Things like free speech. You can't shut up someone you disagree with, who might be the guy pointing out the flaw in your argument. Like empirical testing, if you make a claim about how the world works, then you should really go out and look in the world. That's the basis, of course, of science. peer review. People who know as much about something as you do get to decide whether it's worth publishing, and you take seriously the outlets that do that. A free press, that the journalism, you don't get to throw journalists in jail if they criticize the leaders, and they have a right to print anything they want, subject to very circumscribed exceptions like libel. So these kinds of rules of the game allow us collectively to be more rational than any one of us is individually, at least when they work. And they do work somewhat, because we sent a guy to the moon, and we eliminated smallpox, and we reduced the murder rate, and I mean, not to zero, but it used to be a lot worse.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, as I was listening to you tick those off, a free press, peer review, science, and so on, I can't help but think that this backward country that we're in, it seems that the counter to all of your data is Donald Trump.
Yes.
Right? Weak on rational analysis, weak on truth and reality, lacking humanism, anti-science. Why is the U.S. backward in your analysis? And B, what does this phenomenon say about what you were writing before he was elected?
Yeah, so it's certainly true, and I had to resist the temptation in writing the book to end every chapter by saying, yes, but if Donald Trump gets his way, all of this could go into reverse. And partly because it would have made the book tedious, it would have dated the book, because I myself am careful to try to check my own political biases, so I don't want it to seem like an anti-right-wing book. Nonetheless, it is true that the policies and the mindsets that he represents really are the opposite of these Enlightenment ideals, including an international community, which of course he notoriously is trying to dismantle, including democratic norms, both within the country and his praise of autocrats elsewhere, respect for science, respect for a free press. So yeah, it very much is in opposition to sensible regulation of the environment, dealing
public health,
climate change, all of these things, yeah. And I wondered what the second part of your question is, well, given all of these forces that have been set into motion, where does this come from? And part of the answer is, it may sound like an oxymoron to talk about the intellectual roots of Trumpism. And in fact, one historian of ideas...
to even put those words in the same...
As a concept, yes. And one historian of ideas who I asked, I said, where does this come from? And he said, oh, Trump is pure id. There's no ideas behind id, in the Freudian sense of raw animal instinct. And that's somewhat, it's not completely true, because Trump does have did have a kind of brain trust before he fired them all. You know, Steve Bannon considers himself a literate intellectual, and Michael Anton. And to my shock, 150 academics signed a statement in support of Trump in the summer of 2016. Where are they coming from? They are from the counter-Enlightenment, the latest wave of backlash to the Enlightenment. And there is such a thing as the counter-Enlightenment. In the 19th century, as a reaction to Enlightenment rationality, you had Romanticism, you had nationalism, you had militarism, the idea that there's no such thing as a human being. You're a Frenchman, or you're an Italian, or you're a German, or you're an Englishman, and that the important thing is not to think, but to feel, to express your emotions.
I hear Nietzsche.
Yeah, it led to Nietzsche, who is a big inspiration to the alt-right and to a number of Trump's advisors. So in the context of the history of ideas, the Enlightenment never really took over. And it's one of the reasons why I resist the people equating the Enlightenment with Western civilization. They're not the same thing. The West has always been quite ambivalent about the Enlightenment.
Yes.
There have been counter-Enlightenment currents, and Trumpism, and more generally authoritarian nationalism and populism worldwide, is a kind of counter-Enlightenment backlash.
And the fact that he could display all of those counter-Enlightenment tendencies and still be elected to lead the most powerful nation. I mean, what
the hell happened?
yeah, I
How did
mean,
we get there?
how does it?
I ask
In-
myself
in
that
the
question
epilogue-
every morning. How did this happen? How did we get here? So part of it is, I think that the appeal of counter-Enlightenment themes is perennial because there are parts of human nature that that authoritarians appeal to: our tribalism, our vesting authority in a strong leader. Our demonization, the idea that problems are the fault of bad people who must be punished or marginalized.
Scapegoating. all of that,
Scapegoating,
yes.
exactly, yeah. So I think that those can always be brought out in us, especially among sectors of the population that feel left behind by some of these changes. There's been a lot of progress for gay people, for women, for African Americans and other racial minorities, for the people who are better educated. So what about the people who are none of those, who are white, who are less educated, who are male? Kind of saying, hey, what about, what am I, chopped liver?
Yeah.
And
Arlie
that's-
Hochschild in Stranger in Their Own Land. I don't know if you know, sociologist at Berkeley. She says that there's a story, a deep story, and that it's very much what you're saying. That I'm in line, I'm suffering, and it looks like people are cutting in line, and the government is helping them. That's her story. That's her
I think that's
description
right.
of the story.
There's a backlash to things like affirmative action, and there is a case to be made that it is treating people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. So it's not as if it's not all fascism and irrationality. There is an argument that can be made, and so there is that reaction, and also there are this I think combines with some of the weaknesses in our democratic electoral system, and in some systems in Europe. Not only the Electoral College, where I have a lot of respect for the framers, but they didn't think everything through. Electoral College, the ability to gerrymander,
I don't think they thought they were going to be the last framers.
yeah.
I think they thought that the next generation would improve
Would kind of debug
with progress.
it. Yeah, would debug it.
That's right.
But also,
The Constitution was a beta.
yeah, that's right, yes, 1.0. But likewise, in Europe, populism has political power out of proportion to its numerical strength because of electoral systems that overweight rural areas too, as our Senate does. So they didn't lifetime term for Supreme Court justices. 250 years later, we can see that these needed a little bit of a
By the way,
revamping.
it's not just the Senate. There's a rural favoritism in almost every state legislature.
Oh, and who then in turn
Exactly.
set the
Yeah. I think the
legislative
rural-urban divide is a deep one and fits into this a bit as well.
Yeah, it is. So the other thing, I'll just throw this out. This is a theme I didn't discuss at all in Enlightenment now, but in Better Angels of Our Nature. The United States is not one country, but it's several countries. It used to be a plural. The United States are a big country. And in particular, there's a pretty profound north-south difference, also partly confounded with an urban-rural difference. But the Enlightenment conception of the United States was really much more of a northern thing than a deep south thing, which had the planter aristocracy and some of the kind of old world customs and a different ethic for how society ought to be run.
Okay, I think we're nearly at 8 o'clock, so Ted, if you want to open it up to questions, I may jump in with some more, because I certainly have more, but I want to give the audience a chance.
So it is that time. Like he said, just a quick reminder, around here questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question. And tonight, only Terrence gets to ask follow-up questions.
I respect the question rules. Just briefly, I support anti-gang activities. I support development in Africa. I support mental health issues. am I wasting my time? In other words, are these changes that you mentioned inevitable, or are there global factors that are going to ultimately achieve the goals, or should I continue my efforts?
No, absolutely. The graphs that I present in both books are exactly the reason that you should continue those efforts. Namely, the graphs show they're not a waste of time. They've really led to progress. And so people sometimes think that if there have been improvements, that shows that they somehow happened by themselves, which is exactly what didn't happen. They happened because there were efforts to improve policing and community relations with gangs, and to cure disease and increase crop yields and reduce violence and reduce war. And we're going to need more of them. And the way I present these graphs is showing that they're not a waste of time. They have worked, and obviously none of the graphs have left us where we want to be. We can get the homicide rate much lower than it is right now. And it's exactly those efforts that are precisely not a waste of time. We need more. That's what we have to thank for the progress that we've enjoyed so far. You know, and health efforts in the developing world and all the rest, absolutely.
Hi. What is your view on the future of religion in society, especially in light of your criticism of some of the very old religious texts that we rely on in religion?
Yes, I'm sorry if I'm looking around at random, because the hall is dark.
It's hard.
Yeah, so there is a major process of secularization in the world. That as countries get better educated and richer and more secure, religious belief tends to go down. Religious affiliation tends to go down. The reason that it's often hard to appreciate that is that there are two other trends that go in the other direction. One of them is that religious people have more babies, and then that occurs everywhere and for just about every religion. The other is that the religious sectors are politically better organized. So, for example, even though in the United States, the percentage of Americans who are evangelical Christians is going down. However, they all vote, and they all vote for the same guy. Whereas the humanists, the secularists, the atheists, the agnostics, I'm spiritual but not religious, the so-called nuns, that's N-O-N-E,
Yeah, right.
not N-U-N.
Right.
There are more and more of them, especially as you go down the generations. Every generational cohort has fewer religious people. However, they don't vote. The 85% of evangelicals vote. I think of the so-called nuns, fewer than half voted. So our political system has a stronger influence of the religious than the numbers would warrant. And in parts of the world that still have high fertility rates, it's the religious people that are out reproducing the more secular people. Now that could change because the fertility rates themselves change as societies get wealthier, better educated, and women are more empowered. When women get an education, when they have more rights, they tend to start having babies later and have fewer of them. That is happening worldwide, and it may join with the secularization to further reduce religious belief. But we don't know which of these two forces will be more powerful.
Can I ask one that I hadn't asked, but it was occurring to me as this. One subject which I think a lot of people might have trouble with accepting the everything's getting better premise is inequality. And you devote a whole chapter to it. And so if you would just talk about kind of why, because there does seem to be growing inequality, certainly in the US and in many of the most developed nations. And there's the work of Wilkinson and Pickett, the Spirit Level book that says that in countries that have the most inequality, it's kind of worse off for everyone. What's your take on inequality?
Yeah, a few things. So globally, inequality is decreasing. That is, poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. And so if you do a Gini coefficient, that's the way to give a number between 0 and 1 to the degree of inequality. If you do it across countries, it's going down. And if you try to do it, it's not easy to do it across the whole world population. But as best you could do it, it seems to be going down as well. And again, it's because literally billions of people in China and India and Indonesia are becoming middle class.
Yeah.
Now, within rich countries, it's obviously increasing. But I don't think that inequality is like longevity, education, leisure, health, child mortality. I don't think it's a fundamental dimension of human well-being. That is, I don't think that we're better off if we're more economically equal. If what that just means is that few people at the top are less rich. That by itself doesn't necessarily help the people at the bottom. I think what is a moral issue is poverty, that our efforts should be focused on making poor people wealthier. Now that may reduce inequality, but if it does, it's a byproduct of helping the people at the bottom, not reducing the gap. Because if everyone is living in wretched poverty except for a few people, that's really terrible. And if you make the few people who aren't as poor as everyone else, that doesn't help humanity.
Right.
What helps humanity is making everyone better off. In terms, so that's a moral argument. That's not an economic argument. Then finally, a counter-argument to that could be, well, inequality per se leads to its own pathologies, and they're the work of in the spirit level of Wilkinson and Pickett is relevant. It turns out that their conclusions are, it's not so clear that they're right about inequality per se having negative social consequences. They argue that countries holding constant affluence, that countries that are more egalitarian in
Scandinavian countries, for instance.
Also have lower crime rates, longer lifespans, higher education. The problem is Scandinavian countries are pretty rich. I mean, they are more equal, but they're also pretty rich. They have high GDP per capita. And so it's not so easy to disentangle them. And it depends a lot on which countries you put in the pot. You can have countries that are pretty unequal that do pretty well in terms of human well-being, like Hong Kong and Singapore, and other countries that have reduced inequality that are hellholes, like Venezuela. So a lot depends on which countries you put in. The thing is, it really is much better to live in Norway than Uganda. And the question is that because Norway's more equal or because Norway is richer? And it's probably because Norway's richer.
Right. Okay, thank you. I just didn't want to leave that one out.
Hi. One area it seems that we're going backwards is the fracturing of where everyone gets their media. So everyone seems to have different facts that they argue. I'm thinking specifically of like anti-vaxxers. Is there a way to, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so there is a fragmentation in the media landscape, although, ironically, 25 years ago, everyone was worried about the media monopolies, that there are only 3 channels where you can get all your news, and they're manufacturing consent, as Noam Chomsky put it, and no one could, the poor schnook who doesn't own a newspaper, how can he get his opinions out there? It's very anti-democratic. Well, be careful what you wish for. And it just also is a reminder that we always catastrophize the current situation. So in some ways, if you would go back to the 1990s and say, well, pretty soon anyone could have their own newspaper, their own printing press, have their opinions expressed. You don't have to own the New York Times. And back in the 90s, say, oh, wow, what a great society that'll be. And that's where we are now. We definitely need what we don't yet have, which is ways of reinforcing the idea that not every channel is equally credible. And it often happens when there are new media of communications. It takes a while for there to be safeguards to emerge, for there to be kind of an immune response to the parasites. When affordable books were first printed in the 18th century, there was kind of a wild west of apocrypha and conspiracy theories and plagiarism and doctored documents, and they led to real damage in the age of inexpensive pamphleteering, where there would be pogroms and riots when conspiracy theories about some ethnic group tainting the water, or killing Christian boys to use their blood to make matzah. I mean, there's no shortage of conspiracy theories and fake news in the past. And I think it takes a while for the ecosystem to kind of re-equilibrate. And a reason that in the long run, I think there will always be constituency for the truth, is that, to paraphrase Philip K. Dick, the truth is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. And so reality is reality. It's really out there. You can lie about it, but it's still reality. And there will be people who therefore will want to distinguish the reliable channels from the fake news.
What is the difference between betterment and improvement?
They're pretty synonymous, I would think. I think what you're getting at is, so I'll convert that into a slightly different question, is what counts as progress, what counts as improvement, what counts as betterment? Because the word progress took on some sort of squirrely connotations when it was used, especially in the 60s, in the era of urban renewal. We just bulldozed the neighborhood with all of these stores and bakeries and bars and saloons and put up concrete high-rises. Progress. And so the word progress got tainted as any kind of technological change. And so I would distinguish any technological change with ones that improve measures of human well-being that I think most people would agree upon, ultimately rooted in human nature, but health, education, prosperity, freedom, leisure, opportunities to enjoy nature and culture, opportunities to have social bonds with friends and family. Maybe not everyone would agree those are good things, but probably most people would. And so changes that improve any of those, I would call improvement, betterment, progress.
Yeah, I think at one point you say, if it isn't driven by humanism,
Yeah.
it's not true progress. And so what is your definition of humanism? Because that's where you...
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And in fact, some people say, "Well, do you really need humanism in the title? Isn't that kind of a nerdy organization with some campus people and
how does it rank up there with reason, science, and progress?" Yeah,
and I push back and say it's truly indispensable, because if all you're doing is building biological weapons and 1984 style mind control, then that's not progress. Progress would consist of what I loosely call humanism, namely the idea that morality is rooted in human well-being, where human well-being would be the list of goods that I mentioned in response to the previous question, things like health, education, prosperity, leisure, social, cultural enrichment.
Yeah, so this notion of well-being is what's crucial, right?
Yes, exactly. So the well-being, that's right. So the criteria for well-being give content to the ideal of humanism, and it's the ideal of humanism that tells you which applications of reason and science should legitimately be called progress.
Okay.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I wonder if you might like to say a little more about your idea of the way in which progress relates to your notion of the mind as being more or less hardwired. You brought up the idea of the better angels of our nature and policies that could bring out these better natures. But what happens to the other angels of our nature, the worse angels?
Yeah.
I suggest 2 ideas that you might want to think about. One being the idea of sublimation, and the other being the idea of evolution. Are these ways in which these worse angels of our nature can be dealt with, or how do you see those figuring in?
Yeah, no, it is a profound question, and I do think that I don't think we're going to see evolution in the technical Darwinian sense of a change in gene frequencies over generations resulting from certain people having more surviving babies than others. I mean, that happens, but it happens pretty slowly. There is cultural evolution, which is, I think, a crude metaphor for evolution. It's really historical change, and that's really what both books are about. But calling it cultural evolution, unlike biological evolution, where we know exactly how it works, cultural evolution is just a way of saying, well, things change over time. So it kind of re-raises your question all over again. However, when you refer to sublimation, the Freudian idea of redirecting psychic energy into other channels, I think that does capture something. I wouldn't call it sublimation because I don't really subscribe to a kind of hydraulic model of the mind, but another sort of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic Freudian idea, which is that we have urges, impulses, id, that given to us by evolution that are often lead to ugly antisocial consequences. We have self-control, the ego, that means that we don't act on those impulses. We repress them, sublimation being one of the defense mechanisms, but there's also denial and repression, and that we have a set of norms, the superego, a conscience, a moral system that tells us what you just don't do. That there is something to that, and that would indeed, and I think this is what you were suggesting in the question, that a way that we achieve progress, despite being the same animals we were 50 years ago, even probably 1,000 years ago, is that we do inhibit some of our darker impulses. We have either institutional systems like democracy, like peer review, like journalism, like a free press, like Robert's Rules of Order, that encourage people to engage in self-control. We have cultural norms that you don't just act on, you don't fly off the handle, you don't go into a rage, you don't make lewd comments at every attractive stranger that passes in front of you. And it's, I think Freud, even though I'm very much not a Freudian, that is one thing that I think he got right, that civilization crucially depends on self-control and the repression of impulses. And that itself is part of our nature as well, self-control. It's implemented by circuits in the frontal lobes of the brain. The moral norms that we share through language, we come up with through cognition, which is, together with language, an open-ended combinatorial system. There's no end to the number of ideas that we can conceive and share. And that's what makes it possible for the same species to, even if its wiring hasn't changed over the millennia, to have different ideas and to act in different ways, even with the same impulses and emotions.
And our final question for the evening.
Hi. Have you given any thought to social norms of communication like texting and social media and how they're affecting our ability to trust and form relationships, love, and just generally have a pleasant experience with each other?
Yeah, the social media now get blamed for everything. So I think we are in the midst of a techno panic. A study just came out yesterday. I actually cited an unpublished version of it, that the idea that social media are leading to a generation in crisis, the so-called iGen or Generation Z, born after 1995, turns out to be not true. That social media are not ruining a generation in many ways. The kids are all right. They have actually doing better than the baby boomers, who I think are the real screwed up generation. In terms of mental health, in terms of suicide, in terms of drug overdoses, we will have to adjust to the disruptions of social media as we adjusted to television, and before that to radio, and before that to the mass media of the printing press. But I think I'm skeptical of the habit in long-form journalism to turn every technological development into a crisis. The Atlantic Monthly, a magazine that I subscribe to and I enjoy very much, but they kind of specialize in this. I mean, first it was how smartphones ruined a generation. Then last month it was how young people are having less sex. Now, you'd think this would be kind of a good thing, given that 20 years ago we had stories of how the younger generation was having too much sex. And I don't know if you remember, if you read the Atlantic Monthly in those days, it was girls in high school are giving blowjobs to their classmates in high school stairways, and they're hooking up, and there's no connection, and they're debasing themselves. Well, so that was a panic 20 years ago. Well, now the panic is they're not having enough sex. And the subtitle of this cover story literally was The Retreat from Intimacy. Now, because they're having less sex, there are also fewer pregnant teenagers. There's less sexually transmitted diseases. There's less date rape. So you think this would be something to celebrate. And I don't remember in the era of the girls giving blowjobs to boys in the high school stairwells that the Atlantic Monthly said, oh, we're living in a golden age for intimacy. So, yeah. So, no matter what happens, it's a panic. Now, this is not to say there aren't problems. There are real problems. But there is, I think, a tendency in long-form journalism to turn everything into a crisis.
Ted, I want to ask one last question, which is, a book like this is a lot of work. What is your hope? In other words, you said it kind of grew out of your suddenly finding out that you didn't know how things were improving. What is your hope that the effect could be of getting this information out?
Yeah, aside from promoting the ideals of reason, science, and humanism, which I think are noble, are moral, are uplifting, but to give people enough confidence in the possibility of improvement to rededicate themselves to it. So, I mean, the question that we had about anti-gang activity, about public health, the thing is that if you think that society is getting worse and worse no matter what we do, then a natural response is, well, why even bother? It's just do-gooding. It just makes you feel good.
Resignation, cynicism,
yeah,
all of that.
cynicism, fatalism. On the other hand, if you see that because of efforts to apply our ingenuity to deal with problems, we can eke away at the problems. We can succeed. With some problems we just eliminate altogether, like smallpox. Others we bring the numbers down. I would hope that just that positive mindset, not optimism in the sense of don't worry, everything will turn out okay, but rather if you apply ingenuity and effort to try to improve human welfare, it's not hopeless. You will probably succeed.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.